Today's conservation conversation topic is nonprofit conservation finances. We're going to start with a very short presentation from Nicole Lindner, who is the Director of Field Program Operations at the World Wildlife Fund, and Erin Clausen, who's the Program Manager at the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. Erin also happens to be the Vice Chair of the MWCC Board of Directors, which is, I think, how they both got roped into this. And Nicole's skill with financial tracking is basically what keeps WWF's programs and projects humming in Montana. And that includes many of the programs that Erin manages. So they'll talk a little bit about that. Nicole's presentation is going to focus a little bit more on grants management, which, as we all know, is pretty crucial to conservation work and nonprofit conservation work, and a huge part of our finances. But then after that presentation, we're going to dive a little more broadly into all the other financial sort of tracking questions during the Q&A discussion part, which will be the majority of our time together today. And we would also just like to thank our sponsors for these conservation conversations, Northwestern Energy and Montana DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. And of course, thanks so much to Nicole and Erin for taking the time to present and to share some of their knowledge with us today. I'm gonna get out of this, oops, if I can, and share there. And I'm sorry, Nicole and Erin, do you two want to just introduce yourselves while I am bringing up your presentation?
Sure. Erin, you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. Good to see everybody. Many faces that I know. But I'm Erin Clausen. I manage the Sustainable Ranching Initiative part of our Northern Great Plains program. So WWF has, as many of you probably know, a part of our work that is in local communities in different places around the world, including the Northern Great Plains of North America. And so we have an office in Bozeman that has several staff here and several staff remotely through the Northern Great Plains, working kind of broadly on grasslands, preserving intact grasslands and restoring them, and working with local communities on sustainable food production and local food and tribal conservation and a whole other suite of things. So good to see everybody.
Thanks. And I'm Nicole Lindner, and as Terry mentioned, I'm the Director of Field Program Operations for the NGP programs. So I provide, and I should say my team, it's a lot of people that make it all happen, but provide support, financial, administrative, and operational support to the program to kind of make sure everything gets done and keep things on track, keep everybody on track. So I'm the wrangler of the group, I like to say.
Thanks, Nicole. I think a lot of us can relate to that. But yeah, let's get started.
Great. So if you want to go to the first slide, I just thought as Terry mentioned, this is going to be pretty short. I just kind of wanted to give a quick overview of some of the things to keep in mind as you go through the grant process. And so I split it into 3 phases, which is the proposal development phase and what to think about as you're going through that. Spending money, how to spend money. It seems easy, but sometimes, there are a few things you've got to keep in mind as it relates to spending restricted funding. And then the reporting process. And I'll just say that Erin, I'll kind of touch on some of the financial components, and then Erin can jump in as he wants to talk about the programmatic side and the technical side of those 3 processes. So going to the next slide, if we look at the proposal development, a few things that I think are just good to know about as you go through that process. So the biggest thing, I think, is understanding the difference between restricted and unrestricted funding. So when it comes to money coming in, not all money is created equal. And I like to think of unrestricted funding as kind of like your pot of gold, and that's what you're always striving for. But most of the time you're going to get restricted funding. But when you're thinking about approaching a funder, we're always trying to think of keeping it as high level as possible so that you can be using that money however you see fit, and the donor isn't necessarily dictating what you're spending those funds on. So unrestricted funding would be if a funder comes to you and just says, hey, I want to give you $25,000, do whatever you want with it, I don't need to know about it. That would be considered unrestricted funding. Restricted funding is where you actually are putting together a proposal. You're saying, I'm going to specifically do these things. This is how much it's going to cost me. You'll typically have reporting requirements, which means you have to go back to them and say how you've spent it and show that you've spent it the way you said you were going to spend it. So restricted funding is just requires a little more work. So as you're thinking about a development or a proposal development process, you want to try and keep things as high level as you can when you're proposing a budget, essentially, or if you're asking for funding. I always like to start at the top and say, try to make it as flexible as possible. And then if they need more information, then you can always provide more information, but keeping your budget and your ask as high level as possible gives you the greatest amount of flexibility on the back end when you go to spend it. So that's kind of the ideal way of approaching it. That's not always feasible, and most donors want to give you money for something specific, but you do have those donors that come along that are willing to just give you money, and you can decide what you want to do with it. When it comes to putting a budget together, I think one of the things that I would say kind of complicates things is making sure that you're requesting the funds in the right budget categories. So if you think of, for instance, time comes in a lot of different forms. So for some organizations that might be volunteers, for some organizations you might be payroll, but you might not have payroll at this point. There might not be enough people that you have payroll. So you might be hiring people on a temporary basis. You might have an accountant that's actually a consultant. So even though what you're paying for is time, you want to make sure that you're actually requesting whatever it is you want in the right budget categories. So an accountant that you're paying for might be actually listed under the consultant line and not necessarily on the personnel line. So you always kind of want to think through, how is that expense going to hit the books? How are you going to categorize that expense and make sure that you're just requesting funds in those particular categories, so that then on the back end, when you're reporting, you're lining those up and you don't have to ask for a request, because it's like, oh, actually, even though it is staff time, the way we pay this person is through a contract. And so therefore we have to report that out as a contract and not as salaries. The other thing to think about is direct versus indirect. So certain funders will allow you to charge indirect. Indirect is really used to cover all of those overhead expenses that oftentimes you can't charge directly to a project. So that might be rent, it might be utilities, it might be the cost of a car that you have. So all of those types of things can be covered with the indirect. And so I would always recommend asking the funder whether or not you're allowed to charge indirect. And if you are, incorporating that into your budget so that you make sure you're not just covering your direct project expenses, but also some of those other expenses that sometimes it can be hard to get funding for. And as far as the indirect rate to charge, sometimes that's dictated by the funder. So the funder might say, we have a cap of 12% indirect that you can charge. Sometimes there isn't a cap, and if you don't necessarily have an organizational indirect rate, I feel like 10% is usually the minimum of what people will accept as an indirect rate, and so you can always just use that. And the way you calculate that is you just take your direct expenses and then you calculate by whatever rate you've established, and then that's going to give you your total ask in terms of the budget. So the other thing to think about is some organizations, when you're applying for funding or before they actually grant you the funding, they may request additional information. And generally they're going to use this. It's all being used to kind of assess or establish the level of risk associated with granting those funds. So some of the things you might be asked for would be your articles of incorporation, just so that you're able to substantiate that you are in fact a nonprofit. They may ask you for your current year's budget. So even if that's just kind of showing very high level, it doesn't necessarily have to be super specific, but just showing this is the amount that we have in salaries, this is the amount that we have in travel expenses, or these are overhead expenses. But that just gives them an idea of the size of your organization. They may request a financial statement. They may request a list of your board of directors or an annual report. And all of those things, again, are really just to help understand you as an organization and where you're at and what you types of policies or those types of things that you have available. So kind of where you're at in your evolution. And that usually leads to a risk assessment. And so generally, again, depending on the fund source, you may be asked for policies and procedures that you have in place. So some of the things that might be asked is, do you have a whistleblower policy? Do you have a procurement policy, conflict of interest, an employee handbook? Might feel very overwhelming when you get that request. And we always say, you know, we're asking for those things. That doesn't mean we necessarily expect people to have those things. But again, it just kind of helps the funder understand the nature of the organization and where the organization is at administratively or financially. And then as a result of that, that will help determine the monitoring plan. So essentially the ties that come with that money. So that may look like more financial reporting. So you'll have a financial reporting schedule where you might have to produce financial reports on a quarterly basis, biannual basis, on an annual basis. Same thing programmatically, you might have to provide technical updates as you go through the life of the award. And that's really just a mechanism that the grantee or the grantor has to just keep in touch with the grantee and make sure things are going along as expected, and having a conversation if things are kind of shifting as you move through the project life cycle. Erin, did you want to add anything before I went to the next slide? No? No, okay. Okay.
No, I
Oh,
was just,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing. I wouldn't add too much because I don't think that, unless people ask, I mean, there are sort of a different set of considerations we have on the program side when we're looking for funding opportunities and deciding whether they have alignment with what we can do. I think a couple things that come up a lot related to this conversation specifically, though, have a lot to do with like the restricted, unrestricted sort of categories, and then the indirect. That triggers whether or not we and Nicole like helps us and or makes these decisions on our behalf most of the time, but those are really important triggers for whether or not we would pursue something, because for instance, two funding opportunities that might seem like they would provide the same amount of resources might really not if you can't, for instance, use it in a way that you want to, or allow being allowed to charge indirect so that you can actually recoup the costs that it's going to require you to implement whatever project you're talking about. So like a $10,000 grant that didn't allow you to bill enough indirect, or didn't have enough unrestricted nature to let you do the other parts of your program, might not actually be worth $10,000 as far as like work hitting the ground, if that makes sense. So we do turn things away sometimes for those reasons. I guess I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah. Okay, so just talking through spending, a couple things to think about as you know, some people might just write a check and you get your check and you're good to go. Other times you might have an actual revenue agreement that gets sent to you, and you want to remember that that's a legal agreement. And so before you're signing it, you always want to make sure you're reading through so that you know what you're committing to. And that might outline objectives as well as things you can and can't do. If you're getting USG money, you'll probably get a lot of other additional documents with your revenue agreement, because there's this thing called the 2 CFR 200 policy, and that dictates all the things that you can and can't do with federal money. So again, it's just remembering to really take a look at that agreement and make sure you fully understand what's allowable within the terms of that agreement. So oftentimes some of the things that you'll see as it relates to spending and what we call allowable and unallowable expenses, there might be things like, you know, you can never charge alcohol to a USG funded project. You can't cover lobbying. You can't do lobbying with certain types of funds, and a lot of funders won't allow you to do that. You might have a conflict of interest clause in there. So I just think it's always good to really read through carefully and make sure you fully understand what you can use the money on and what you can't. Obviously tracking, and I know this seems to have come up with a lot of different people, in terms of keeping the data organized. That's obviously a huge part of nonprofit accounting, is somehow being able to segregate your expenses by the fund source. So whether or not that's you have QuickBooks and you can actually create a code that you have for each particular fund source, it might just be a tracking sheet, an Excel sheet, but really being careful about allocating out those expenses and keeping them separated. So when on the back end, you need to report back to donors, there's some way for you to extract that information and that subset of information and just be looking at that and reporting that back to the donor. Time is a big one as far as tracking. Oftentimes you may not have you know, timesheet or time tracking system. But again, if you're requesting payroll or salaries from a funder, you want to be able to track that time. So even if it means creating a spreadsheet or a timesheet in Excel, that can be helpful for tracking your time. It doesn't really need to be super complicated. Going to my next point, it's just you always want to be documenting. Document. I always say it's the cover your ass clause. And so what that is really anytime you're spending money, you want to be able to substantiate what you're spending it on. Receipts, obviously keeping receipts, but even if, for instance, I mean, people forget receipts, that doesn't always happen. But if you don't have a receipt, send an email to yourself that's saying, hey, I spent this money, so that you actually have documentation. Which kind of leads me into the point about an audit. Like, again, in the agreement, the funder might specify you have to keep your records for a certain amount of time, and that's because they may get audited, and then they may then push that audit down onto you. So they may say, hey, I'm going to pick a certain amount of transactions, and I need you to provide me with the backup for all of those transactions. So always be documenting. And even if you don't actually have the receipt or the invoice, even just making a note that shows that you did do that is enough and better than not having anything. So then going to the third category, so if we think about reporting, when you get a revenue agreement, or if you get new money and there is reporting associated with it, you'll generally have a deliverables schedule. So it should outline what your responsibilities are in terms of getting information back to the funder. If it doesn't have one, I would always ask just to make sure, so that you understand. There's nothing worse than somebody being like, oh, where's our report? And you're just like, oh, I had no idea we had to do that. So knowing what you're going to be asked to produce helps figure out how you might want to set up and track the information. So I always like to ask for that ahead of time. I would always set up reminders on your calendars ahead of time for the lifetime of the grant of the project, so that you don't forget those deliverables. I have something where I have a reminder 3 months out, 2 months out, 1 month out, just because you can get really busy. And it's just always good to have those reminders to keep you on track. I would request, if possible, a reporting template at the beginning from the funder, if they have one. Again, that's really just so that you have a sense of what you're going to be asked to produce, so that when the reporting comes, you have things set up in such a way that it makes it easy for you to get back that information back to the donor. And then I would just say monitoring the expenses over the grant life is good. You don't have to do it all the time, but maybe you do it quarterly or every 6 months. You're just kind of looking at where you stand. Because then when you go through the reporting process, that's always a great opportunity to request any changes. It's not uncommon for things to change over the course of a project, and typically the funder will understand that. But the sooner you can flag those possible changes and either request a budget reallocation, or maybe it's a no-cost extension because unforeseen things have happened and you need more time, the sooner you kind of get that on the radar, the better. And typically most funders will be pretty amenable to really what they're looking for is the outcome of the funding. They're not always as concerned about how you actually get there. So kind of keeping those lines of communication open as you move through the life of a grant is really helpful, in terms of then having that flexibility to move things around as they come up. I try to keep that quick so that we have time for questions. So I apologize if that was rushed, but yeah, I will leave it at that for now, unless Erin, you want to add anything.
No, I think that was great. I just have my own questions for you now, Nicole, but I'll ask you those later.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nicole. That was, there's a lot of information to pack in. And so we really appreciate that. Now I would like to open it up to questions, and questions of Nicole and Aaron. Also, feel free to share your own experiences and ideas. The purpose of these is to learn from one another and have more of a conversation. But I understand you may also have questions for Nicole and Aaron, including more general financial questions as well. And because this conversation is so relevant to the small watershed conservation organizations that MWCC supports, I would like us to prioritize questions from those organizations. If you don't work for a Montana watershed group or conservation district, you're still welcome to contribute, but just consider waiting until representatives of those local groups have had the chance to speak. I can also monitor questions in the chat, but I'd love it if people could turn their screens on and just raise your hand or just unmute and ask any questions or share any of your own experiences with finances and grant management.
I'll jump in. I have a question. If anybody has an opinion on when you're applying for grants, do you think it's more advantageous to have a certain number of members in your nonprofit as opposed to a certain dollar amount for memberships? I know some of you don't really operate with memberships and that sort of thing, but we're thinking about dropping the amount to join as a member in order to get more numbers, thinking that might show more engagement.
Yeah, I would say reach is probably, I mean, I think every funder has a different set of metrics.
Yeah.
So I think it's helpful to do research as to, what each funder is really looking for.
Okay.
But certainly I would say reach.
Okay.
Is one of them.
Yeah, I was gonna say it on the first slide. I think there's a lot of, I've seen, and mostly for good reason, a lot of people put a lot of effort into a proposal and to flesh out as much really fine detail on everything, citation, science as possible. And I think funders like that. They want to know that people can execute the questions that they're asking about, including like you demonstrating that you have the reach, like Nicole said, to activate this much work on the ground or that sort of thing. Otherwise you would just be sort of citing, like just speculating on how much reach you have. So in that sense, and we don't have a membership, we're not usually citing our membership necessarily, but we are citing like the number of direct partners we have, which is a great way to demonstrate your previous effectiveness too.
Okay.
We're also not a membership organization, and so when we've applied for grants, we'll indicate we have a newsletter that goes out. So how far our newsletter goes, or even, it's not a great metric, but we've got a Facebook page, and then we also try to track the numbers of attendees at some of our events or the number of volunteers that we've had participate in programs to show a level of community engagement and support, as well as a list of some of the partners that we've worked with.
Great. Good thoughts.
And I think too, you could also show growth. So that might be another metric, is showing here's where we were however many years ago, and here's where, so that demonstrates the fact that it's being successful and your reach is expanding, and that the expectation is these funds will contribute to further reach or expansion or whatever the content is.
And I think a lot of times those memberships would be coming in as unrestricted funds too. So in a lot of ways they have outsized value. Like if you're putting in, like say you have 20% overhead and you're putting in for like a $5,000 grant, it'll only let you charge $1,000 of indirect. But you can make that, the rest of that up, or I guess 500 would be 10%. So you could make that other $500 up really easily with the unrestricted membership funds. Otherwise you'd be in the hole to actually like put that project on the ground, right? You would be in the red just to use
Yeah.
those funds.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great question, whether, like you guys brought up earlier, whether the grant is actually worth it.
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes if you don't have the capacity to do it, if it's kind of taking you off course, it's really, I mean, it's easy when you see the money to be like, oh, it's money, but really thinking about how does it advance your objectives, and hopefully it's working for the funder and for you, and that's why it makes for a good partnership. But sometimes you don't want to get kind of pulled off course because you start going for donors and their objectives might not be yours, and all of a sudden now you don't have enough capacity to do the things you actually want to be doing with your organization, and you're spending all this time, even though it might be funded, doing things that aren't necessarily advancing your larger vision.
Okay, other thoughts, questions?
See Nancy talking, but she's, oh,
Sorry. I had a comment and then a more specific question. My comment gets a little bit to what Nicole just said, which is I noticed that it can be really tempting when we see a grant opportunity come through to go, oh, what could we do with that? Rather than at the beginning of every year, we take some time to really try to intentionally set out what are the things that we want to accomplish in that year. And then, to see ways that we might be able to support it. So not following this other piece that may sound really good, and maybe we might want to do that, but is that at the expense of other priorities? I think is super important, because it can be so tempting, like, oh, there's this great, pot of money for this, maybe we should do it. And then my more specific question is, we don't have paid staff, so sometimes we may be applying for grants where we will likely be using contracted services, but also if there's an opportunity for in-kind services, I always find it challenging from a budgeting perspective, how to put a $1 per hour value on in-kind services, and whether that would be at X professional rate or just sort of a general kind of, I don't know, like regular hourly rate, or if I have a rate that I might charge as a consultant, but I have a nonprofit rate. I mean, I don't know how to, like, for a board member or a volunteer, how do we value those hours?
Yeah, Nancy, I'm gonna let people answer this, but we did do a conservation conversation all about this, which is
Awesome.
like with Christine Brissett, more of like how to track that in-kind match,
Great.
but also like it gets into billing rates and stuff. So I'm going to drop that.
Okay.
It's all in the Conservation Conversations webpage, but I'll drop that in the chat and then I'll let others.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That's great to know. Thanks.
I would just say generally, sometimes I get into this loop of what's the right way? And oftentimes there's 3 or 4 different ways. I think the important part is just documenting why you're evaluating it the way you are. And if you have a reasonable, like you're saying, here's the fair market value for this particular thing. I did research, here's what I found. And so therefore, this is the methodology that I'm applying. I think sometimes we worry more about what the right methodology is, as opposed to, as long as it's a reasonable methodology that you can substantiate and you're saying, this is why I applied it, this is how I applied it. That's really what auditors or whatnot are going to be looking for, is kind of just that it's reasonable, that somebody could look at it and say, okay, this makes sense. It's not like completely outlandish. Yeah, that would be my just quick response to that.
Yeah, running like the Watershed Fund, which is MWCC's sub-granting, we just generally tell people, like, if this person was not giving, in your case, board members, right? If this person was not donating their time, what would you have to pay them? And like Nicole said, as long as it's not outrageous, we're gonna be like, okay, that sounds reasonable. So yeah, some people will specifically ask for what is your billing rate, but not everyone knows what their billing rate. So just what you would have to pay that person is, yeah, fine.
Great, and thanks for that resource on the previous conversation. I didn't have that on my radar, so thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Other questions?
I was
about
gonna
grants?
jump in.
Yeah.
Nicole, I had a question if you, going off of one of the others is if you thinking about reach and maybe both Erin and Nicole, how you can think about when you're trying to create a new program, a strategy for determining what you want to set as benchmarks when you're like, I don't know, it's new, we need to plan. And maybe in that vein, like how you're able to strategize to really ask for enough planning needs for your program.
I didn't know if you wanted to jump in first, Erin, or.
Sure. I mean, I think it's kind of a big question. In many cases, I think planning and early execution are kind of overlapped. Like it's hard to spend and get a ton of funds to run a business while you're in the planning phase and not doing anything else. But I mean, I think for us, it's a little bit of, and we don't do this like down to the cent, but planning what the cost would be of running the entire program. And that's not just like the dollars that we put into the conservation efforts, but really importantly, the indirect rates. And I see a question about that in the chat. Because I think unless you account for the full cost of all those things, you can't afford to do it. And if you can afford to do it, then you're not going to be meeting your mission for very long.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. And I will just, read that question out from Brooke. We've heard that donors are moving away from allowing indirect costs. Have you seen this trend occurring?
We haven't. I wouldn't say no.
The best, I mean, the nearest that we have seen to that is there's some government funds that I think are like statutorily restricted in how much indirect they can allow for, unless you have a negotiated indirect rate, which is a whole thing that a nonprofit can go through to demonstrate their overhead, which is a good thing to do if you want a lot of government funds. But I would say again, like if you can't through some combination of indirect and your unrestricted funds, like through your membership, cover the full cost of program implementation, including staff time, vehicles, travel, then that's not a program that you can afford to do.
I have kind of a follow-up question to this that comes up from time to time. And that's in terms of indirect, right, for grants that may not allow indirect costs or may not allow them explicitly. What do you guys, we've had this conversation about billing rates a lot, right? And your billing rate is not just your hourly wage. It is also your health insurance if you have it. It's your workers' comp, it's your taxes, it's your everything. But also, what about including overhead and all of those things in your billing rate so that it's just like your billing rate covers your liability insurance, covers your rent, covers your workers' comp, all that, like, is that a possibility?
You may be. I think it comes back to the funder. I mean, a funder might balk if it's like, my rate is $150 an hour. They might be like, eh. But you could also, I feel like you could try direct charging those expenses. So actually itemizing them and saying like, here's a portion, figuring out some methodology. But for instance, one of the things we do is because we have overhead, but it goes to DC. So it goes to our accounting department, our legal department. The NGP program doesn't actually get those dollars back. And then we have specific costs associated with being a field office. So we have an office and we have rent. And so we call it common cost recovery. And what we do is we pool all of those expenses. So the annual expense of rate, utilities, vehicle maintenance, all of those things. And then we essentially say, let's say it's $100,000 and we have 10 employees. So essentially every employee is worth is costing $10,000. And then if we essentially say, this person is contributing 50% of their time towards this project, then we're gonna charge $5,000. So we're gonna take 50% of those common costs, and we're gonna request that as part of the grant. And so that's above and beyond indirect. And some funders will go for it and some funders won't. But that's another way that you could kind of go about it. Yeah.
Good to know.
And then you could also just try saying, here's a percentage of the rent and itemize it out. And again, see what the funder says. But I guess if they're not allowing indirect, they're probably not going to want to do that. But
Yeah.
It just depends on the funder.
Yeah. And I asked that question too, because again, through the Watershed Fund, when people apply to grants through us, I see people with billing rates of like $25, $30, and I'm like, no, hi, like, no, I just think, I think there's a lot of room there. I don't think funders would bat an eye at like a $45 billing rate. And so, but yeah, obviously we have to work within all those guidelines too. And I was curious too, I know we had in the registration, we had a lot of questions about more nitty gritty tracking. Like obviously I know the World Wildlife Fund is not using Excel spreadsheets to track all their finances and grant management. And we're not here to like, the software that works for you is the software that works for you, right? But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that actual, when you talked about, I think at some point you talked about assigning codes to different grants. And I know that sometimes there are different tasks within grants that you might have to say, we spent this much time on this task and this much time. How do you, just in general terms, how do you go about tracking that?
Yeah, so we use Workday. We have a bunch of different systems. We have one system for, grant management, and then our accounting system is Workday. But I mean, I think you can use QuickBooks. I think the concept for us is really every single transaction is tagged with what we call a fund source code. So essentially, anytime you're doing any transaction or when you're budgeting, you're always budgeting by that particular code. And so that allows you then to be able to easily extract out associated expenses. And I think, it's one thing if you have a couple grants. When you start having more, it gets really complicated to keep track of which goes with which. And so even if you have an Excel spreadsheet that you're working off of, just kind of tagging and dividing up everything into the buckets that they need to live in, I would say is essential in terms of after a certain point, it just gets too hard otherwise to keep track of where everything goes.
Mm-hmm.
And usually if you're using QuickBooks, I'm sure there's, you have additional numbers you can generate within your general ledger that should allow you to create these tags. So if you have an accountant or whatever, they should be able to do that.
Got it. Okay, thanks. And I do more questions. I also wanted to kind of, as we're at the end here, open it up to some of our out of state friends. If you have questions at all, feel free to join in now too. I'm not hearing one, but
Magical formula for how much staff time, grant tracking and billing. I mean, I feel like that really depends on where you're at and the systems that you have available. I think it's probably a lot more laborious if you don't have a good tracking system. It's probably going to take you a little bit longer in terms of how much time it's taking you on the back end to keep track of everything, and whether or not you have somebody whose responsibility that is, as opposed to somebody who's doing multiple things. Because it's hard I think, to jump in between different functions and wearing different hats. I can imagine you're doing one thing and then you kind of have to shift into the finance hat, which sometimes can take you a little bit to get back into that role and like orient yourself to everything that's going on. But I think that's where setting up a system in advance and knowing what you're going to be asked to report on is really helpful, because that can help you set up systems in the beginning that make it easier for you to get what you need when you need it. So that's what I would say in terms of trying to be as efficient as possible in the realm of tracking and billing, is really setting up systems that allow you to easily access the data however you're going to need to access it, and thinking about that ahead of time versus on the back end.
Yeah. Thanks
And we
for
use
that.
Excel a ton.
Yes. Yeah. Excel is my best friend. It's my happy place.
It's good to hear that it is for some people. It's wonderful. It's a helpful tool. Well, I'm going to start to wrap us up here. If we have any more questions, you want to throw them in the chat, and we might get to them in the last couple minutes. But I just wanted to reiterate again that we are hosting this fundraising workshop in April. So there won't be a conservation conversation in April, because we'll be busy at an in-person fundraising workshop in Helena. I just dropped the link for that again. And that fundraising workshop is not targeted at grants. Just to be clear, that's sort of that is like, how can we get more of that pot of gold, unrestricted funding, right? How can we broaden our funding horizons into more fundraising and the storytelling that it takes to go into that. And that also is going to get into more of these financial pieces as well, which are crucial to be able to expand your fundraising. The next actual conservation conversation, which if Kira could drop the conservation conversations page in the chat again, that would be great. But our next conservation conversation is going to be a follow-up on that fundraising workshop with one of the workshop presenters, certified fundraising executive Shani Okert. And Shani is going to be doing a little follow-up on the workshop, but also if you can't attend, you can ask some questions. But yeah, it'll be kind of some follow-ups and additional Q&A related to that workshop, but anyone is welcome to attend. You don't have to go to the in-person workshop to do that. That's going to be May 22nd, and these have always been at noon, but for various reasons, that one is going to be from 1 to 2:30 p.m. So just a note that one's not at noon. And I meant to mention this at the beginning, but I will email everybody in the next few days with the recording of this, as well as the slides, and a couple of the links that were mentioned here. Yeah, and then you can also continue this conversation. We do have a watershed coordinators forum that you can sign up for if you're not already signed up for, and ask questions of one another there. There's an option that you can actually get notifications anytime someone posts something, so you can see what questions are coming up around this or other topics in the Montana watershed world. And thanks again. It's been kind of exciting to see some out-of-state people here, as well as some more familiar faces. Yeah, I hope you all took a lot away from this. And thanks again to Nicole and Aaron for volunteering their time here with us. Yeah, any closing thoughts from anybody? And just noting, there is some conversation going on in the chat about different tracking systems that people use too.
I can post it on the forum too, but if anybody else has a membership or financial tracking software that they use, like Donor Perfect, Neon, Boomerang, any of those that you like or don't like, because we're in the process of looking elsewhere.
Yeah.
Nancy, do you use one for your memberships? Like, how do you keep track of your memberships and renewals, and do you communications?
We're not a membership-based organization, and so
sorry.
We're so small that the amount of time, this was intentional, the amount of time that it would take to do that and ask for renewals and all of that, frankly, is more than we can do.
Okay.
Yeah, but there are some, like MWCC uses a little green light. There's some other suggestions in there too. So,
Green light, yeah, for that one.
okay. Well, yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to Nicole and Aaron. Thanks to our sponsors, Montana DEQ and Northwestern Energy. And yeah, thanks for all coming and being active and asking questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.